Hi, hello, and welcome to the Hindu. Khaleda Zia, Bangladesh's first woman prime minister, and who was also a prominent political figure in South Asia for over 3 decades, passed away today on December 30th at the age of 80, uh, after a prolonged illness. Thrust into politics in 1981 after the assassination of her husband, General Ziaur Rahman, Khaleda Zia had transformed herself, uh, from what she herself called a shy housewife into one of the formidable political figures of Bangladesh. And she helped end the military dictatorship in 1990. And she served two full terms as prime minister from 91 to 1996 and 2001 to 2006. And her death clearly leaves a huge vacuum in Bangladesh's politics at a time when the country is, undergoing massive changes, socio-political changes. So, what was Khaleda Zia's legacy, and how her death is going to impact Bangladesh's politics? How she had shaped Bangladesh's relationship with India as well as other countries in the region. To discuss these issues, I am today joined by my colleagues Suhasini, Haidar, and Kallol Bhattacherjee. Thanks, Suhasini, Kallol, for joining me. So,
Thank you.
Suhasini, to begin with, the question that comes to my mind is, how do you look at Khaleda Zia's legacy? Because it's a very complex personality. When I look at Khaleda Zia as a politician or as a prime minister, she was a legendary fighter against the military dictatorship. She came to power through the democratic elections, but at the same time, on the other side, she faced a lot of allegations. She was arrested. She faced corruption cases. So, and also she was also accused of having close ties with Islamists. And I was reading your piece about the battle of Begums between Khaleda and
I think we lost Stan for a minute there, but just to start with talking about Begum Khaleda Zia's legacy is a difficult one for any politician who has been on the scene of her country's leadership at the fore since 1981. Really, that's when her husband General Ziaur Rahman was assassinated in their home. Up till then, she had, as Stan pointed out, this sort of shy existence, and she was born, interestingly, on August 15th, a year before India's independence, and of course, at that time, East Pakistan, which was Bangladesh, as well. And she had come through as the wife of essentially a Pakistani military soldier, someone who fought against India in 1965. But then somebody who then moved to the liberation movement. He was someone known to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman became prime minister and then president of the newly founded country in 1971. He was General Ziaur Rahman, Sheikh Begum Khaleda Zia's husband, was somebody that he knew, that he even promoted. He was deputy army chief during the brutal and really shocking assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his entire family. Sheikh Hasina was one of the few to survive, along with her sister, because she was not in the country at the time. But everybody else in the family, nearly 20 members in all, just passed away, were killed brutally by army officers. General Ziaur Rahman took over then charge in 1977. So this assassination of Sheikh Mujib was in 75. And in 1977, we saw President Ziaur Rahman come to power. But then in 1981, much as Sheikh Mujib had been killed in his home, General Ziaur Rahman was assassinated. Begum Zia is supposed to have fainted when she heard that her husband was no more. Subsequently, and parallels are always drawn across the subcontinent because we have so much tragedy of this kind, assassinations in the past decades. There, people, leaders whose wives and widows and daughters have then taken over. So in that sense, Begum Khaleda Zia, after a period of mourning, came into the fore, started to lead the Bangladesh National Party, and then began to fight this fight, as you pointed out, Stan, between her and General Ershad, who had taken over next. And in this, we saw something very interesting, that for the last time, really, but also the first time, Begum Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina were on the same side. They both fought for democracy in Bangladesh. They both fought against the autocratic ways of General Ershad, street protests that eventually forced him to step down. And eventually, Bangladesh had its first free and fair elections, 20 years after it was actually born, with the first woman prime minister, Begum Khaleda Zia, winning that election. So in a sense, if you notice, whether it's Sheikh Hasina's condolences today, whether it's Prime Minister Modi's condolences today, a lot of the focus is on the part that Begum Khaleda Zia played in the original nascent Bangladesh democracy. Since then, of course, she was mired. Her tenure, she had 3 terms, 2 terms and one really 2-week-long term in 1996. Her tenures were mired by all these allegations of corruption, although she was acquitted in the last case just this year, as well as for the fact that she took support from the Jamaat-e-Islami, which at the time of Bangladesh's liberation had actually been a pro-Pakistan party. And a lot of her legacy does remain that she kind of mainstreamed and brought the Jamaat-e-Islami to a point in Bangladeshi politics from which they are very difficult to dislodge. Even though herself and, of course, her husband had been part of the liberation movement, they were themselves part of what was considered that time the new Bangladesh that was secular and that was following the path of Sheikh Mujib. But over time, we saw a very different side of Begum Khaleda Zia's government. One of the big parts of the tensions with India was the fact that during her tenure, radical Islamist groups as well as northeastern groups that were inimical to India found shelter, found the ability to have their training camps in Bangladesh. Another big event was in Pirdiwa, just before she lost elections. Then just after she had won elections, in 2001, where border rangers from Bangladesh and the BSF clashed, and we saw those terrible pictures of an Indian BSF soldier being returned with his body strung on a pole. And that caused real tensions between India and Bangladesh. Apart from that, Begum Khaleda Zia's tenure was not in a sense ever seen as part of, seen as very pro-India. She did do most of her military purchases from China, close ties with the US as well, and of course with Pakistan as well. This was a real contrast, of course, to Sheikh Hasina. So in New Delhi, there was always a little bit of misgivings when it came to the BNP. But of course, since then, much has changed. We've seen India and New Delhi and the BNP also restore their ties.
Hi, thanks, Suhasini. I'll come back to you about Bangladesh's ties with India, especially during the Khaleda Zia period. So before that, Kallol, as someone who is closely following Bangladesh's politics, domestic politics, Suhasini also mentioned Khaleda Zia's ties with Jamaat-e-Islami. So my question is this: how do you look at the political ideology of Khaleda Zia, both as the prime minister and the opposition leader? Because could we say that, Jamaat-e-Islami was a party that opposed Bangladesh's liberation in 1971, and Jamaat also was steadily opposed to Bangladesh's secular trajectory, the early secular trajectory in the 1970s. So could we say that Khaleda Zia brought Jamaat Islami into the political mainstream of Bangladesh? And the general question is, how do you look at her political ideological outlook?
Well, thank you, Stanley. And I think this is a very significant day to discuss Khaleda Zia, because the time that in which she has left Bangladesh and international politics. But let me begin by saying that though she turned Jamaat leaders into ministers in 2001, the cabinet that she brought in 2001, in which she, I think, had three Jamaat ministers. The fact is that Jamaat leaders, or Jamaat, some of the prominent Jamaat figures who had participated in the genocide of 1971 had been active in Bangladesh politics prior to that period. Because if we even go back in time to early 1970s, the Jamaat leaders had reinvented themselves as the leaders of this organization called JSD. It's in Bangladesh is known as Jashad, but JSD became an extremist organization, and there was a time in the mid 70s when they had in fact carried out a violent attack on the then Indian High Commissioner in Dhaka, Shamar Sen. And that was the time when Jamaat leaders were reinventing themselves and then pitching them or launching them into Bangladesh politics. Subsequently, during the 1980s, Jamaat was playing a role in some way or the other. Sometimes they would try to support the anti-Ershad movement. Sometimes they would blackmail the Ershad government. And though it is highly problematic, but let us also remember that during 1996, when Sheikh Hasina was challenging the election result that came that went in favor of Khaleda Zia. It is said that Sheikh Hasina actually had an unwritten agreement with Jamaat, and she received Jamaat's support, which in fact swung the political situation in her favor. And then Khaleda was forced to resign in that brief period, because that government wasn't getting international recognition, and it lasted only a couple of weeks. And then came the Sheikh Hasina government. Of course, Sheikh Hasina did not make any overt political agreement with Jamaat Islami. And then, of course, what came was that when the timing of the Jamaat BNP government from 2001 to 2006 actually coincided, unfortunately for Khaleda, that it coincided with the war on terror, which was being led by the United States, and AFPAC was the main theater of that war on terror. So it also backfired on her very badly, and Sheikh Hasina caught that opportunity and then went ahead and reminded the whole country that the chapter on Jamaat Islami was not over, and that the people who were complicit in the genocide of 1971 had to be punished. And then she reinvented her politics in 2008 and came back to win the 2009 election, in which she got a thumping majority, and Jamaat leaders subsequently were tried in the International Crimes Tribunal. So to answer your question, from the beginning, that Jamaat had always been there in Bangladesh politics in some way or the other. They were willing to be used by various segments, and there were obviously an unwritten account about Hasina and Jamaat leaders working together for a very, very brief period. But that's part of Bangladesh's politics. We all were quite bit remember it. But then you asked about what is really the political legacy or political character of Khaleda Zia and her career. What really the primary characteristic of a political career. I would say the primary characteristic of Khaleda Zia's political career is really pursuit of power. Here was a lady who was, by her own description, a shy housewife of Dhaka. And she came actually from the western part of Bengal. And then she went on to become this prime minister. And within a decade of her husband's assassination, she became the prime minister of Bangladesh at a time when the Cold War was coming to an end, when the Babri Masjid demolition movement was gaining ground in India. And in that situation, she emerged as the prime minister and established herself by defeating the Ershad government of 1982 to 1990, And then she managed to again throw out Sheikh Hasina from the equation for those 5 years. She remained in power, though Sheikh Hasina very strongly continued to attack her, especially her handling of the 1991 cyclone. But let us also remember that despite all the problems that she faced internationally, she managed to get invited to New Delhi. Narasimha Rao, and then I think Narasimha Rao visited Dhaka as well for the SAARC summit that she hosted in her first term. So I think she played a very careful role when it came to pursuit of power, but she kept power and following it very thoroughly at the center of her politics. Otherwise, she won't have had such a long political career, because I think in the history of this subcontinent, her political career actually begins little before Sheikh Hasina's career, though because Sheikh Hasina was in exile in India. But whereas as the spouse of the president of Bangladesh, she was already meeting Morarji Desai and Indira Gandhi even before Sheikh Hasina actually, went back to Dhaka and got established. So in that way, her connection with the power elite of South Asia is in some ways older than any contemporary politician who are currently operating in Bangladesh or are connected with Bangladesh and are now in exile away in different countries, including in India. So I think her career is a kind of a testimony how if a politician pursues power in a very single-minded manner and then works on it and in a way also leaves a lasting imprint on her own people. Because at the end of it, whether we like it or not, she managed to be the first prime minister of an Islamic, it's not really a fully Islamic country, but a Muslim majority country. And that was also a time when Benazir Bhutto was the prime minister of Pakistan. And in a way, it was also an answer of Bangladesh that Bangladesh could also match Pakistan, because here was a woman prime minister from Bangladesh who was hosting them for SAARC summits and other such international meetings. So I think she really leaves a complicated legacy for the country, but her politics is the politics of power.
Thanks, Kallol. Before I move to the next question, one request to our audience. If you have any questions to Kallol and Suhasini, please type them out and send it here. I'll relay the questions to them. Suhasini, I just saw a quote, a very interesting quote by Khaleda Zia. She says that we are a religious people, but we are not fanatics. We are not extremists. And we are a liberal people, and we are a free people, and we want women to join all the political and economic spheres of Bangladesh. Khaleda Zia is the first woman prime minister of Bangladesh, and that is a historically important role. And what role did she play in the empowerment of Bangladeshi women? I mean, as the prime minister?
Well, it's interesting, Stan, because so much happened in Bangladesh in the 1990s, half of which Begum Khaleda Zia was the prime minister of the country. First, this is a new democracy. It had come through a decade of, presidential dictatorship or authoritarian rule, including under her own husband. It was also a time when a lot of other social movements were beginning inside Bangladesh. Professor Muhammad Yunus, who's now today fighting for his own legacy, really, as the caretaker leader, the interim leader in Bangladesh before elections there. Those were the times when the Grameen Bank was really being seen around the world. You were seeing women being handed a cell phone. Or in those days, it was a WLL phone, really, but a mobile phone by which they were able to then become the connection points for the entire country. So in a sense, the Grameen Bank funded these, also other projects, which really put women to the fore. So what we were seeing was a rebirth, if you like, of Bangladesh. It had been a disappointment for India, who had been such a critical part of Bangladesh's birth in 1971, and the relationship with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman that was suddenly snapped, with Bangladesh, which was suddenly snapped because not only was Mujib killed, his successors did not carry on that very close relationship with India. What we had seen, I first met Begum Khaleda in 1996. And what we had seen in that period was that, India was no longer taught in the history books as a supporter of Bangladesh's liberation. There was a much closer relationship back with Pakistan that had been responsible for so many atrocities, but a lot of that had been papered over, if you like. Khaleda Zia could have done much more to maybe bring some of her own democratic values to the fore, but she was hemmed in also by her own coalition partners. And certainly after that, in 2001, when she came in, as Kallol was describing, with the Jamaat in her cabinet, it became that much more difficult. Another thing that happened was, what was called the Battle of the Begums, and you can read my story online about it, was that from a position where she and Sheikh Hasina had essentially been on the same side fighting for democracy, the two women now became antagonists. And as leader of the opposition, Sheikh Hasina really began to target Begum Khaleda Zia, and it became very personal between the two. So by 1996, when Khaleda Zia's term ended, it was actually really about these two women fighting each other, no longer as much about the story of women's empowerment in Bangladesh. And they began to represent two very different visions of Bangladesh as well. Obviously, in India, there is an affinity with Sheikh Hasina, not only with her father, but the fact that she had taken refuge in India after her father's assassination, the fact that she really espoused a better relationship with India, and she bore that out as a prime minister, and that she stood for a secular Bangladesh. And Khaleda Zia, as a result, became kind of the opposite of that vision, even if, as you point out, that isn't how she really had started out. She was a military wife. She had her two sons, and she was bringing them up, and she was sort of thrust into this life. But then she did do what it took to fight for democracy. She and Sheikh Hasina together in the street protests that really brought Arshad to step down. What we saw after that really became much more almost like whatever one did, the other was the opposite. So if Khaleda Zia worked a lot closer with the United States and with Pakistan, that was the opposite to what Sheikh Hasina did. And to your point about what happened with women, there was a social movement inside Bangladesh, and the fact that the two most important leaders in the country were women, I think that spurred on a lot of the sort of the spring we saw in terms of women coming to the fore across Bangladesh. And then, as I said, there was Professor Muhammad Yunus's role as well before a lot of this politics went sour. I should put in another point, and if you have seen the Twitter of the author Taslima Nasreen, she does make the point that it was Begum Khaleda Zia in her two terms that insisted her books be banned because of the kind of outrage they had created with the clerics and with the more fundamentalist sections of Bangladeshi society. So you see many symptoms of the fact that while Khaleda Zia, as you said, did represent a woman leader, the first woman prime minister of the country, and someone who was both friends and battling this other very powerful woman figure, actually it became very clear over time that Khaleda Zia was depending much more on the coalition partners than perhaps had been expected. She also did not take many opportunities to forge better ties with India and to forge more cross-regional ties as well. She really opposed any kind of transit trade, for example, from the northeast of India across Bangladesh. And this is something, of course, we saw a lot happen during Sheikh Hasina's times. So there were a lot of opportunities that were lost, although, as Kallol did point out, we're talking about the older part of her tenure. Towards the end of her last tenure as Prime Minister, from 2001 to 2006, the tensions between India and Bangladesh did subside. We did see Prime Minister Vajpayee and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh engage with Begum Khaleda Zia. And towards the end of her tenure, it almost seemed as if relations were about to get better.
Hi. So one follow-up question. You met her, you interviewed Khaleda Zia, no? So can you tell us a little bit about the meeting? Because you have interviewed many leaders. You have interviewed Sheikh Hasina as well, if I am not mistaken. So how did the interview go? What kind of a leader you saw in Khaleda Zia when you met her in person?
So, they're like chalk and cheese, the two leaders, because of their past, because of, although both had been hit by tragedy in their own families. One's husband was assassinated, and Sheikh Hasina, of course, lost her entire family. Khaleda Zia, by the time I was in Dhaka to cover the elections in 1996, had become a slightly remote figure. It had been 2 years since the entire opposition had more or less walked out of Parliament. And by the 1996 February elections, it's an interesting year because in 1996, Bangladesh had not one but 2 elections. And the story just went like this. Khaleda Zia insisted on holding elections. Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League and the opposition boycotted them because they said they weren't free and fair. They wanted a proper caretaker government to take over, power between them, between the two governments. And as a result, Khaleda Zia felt very upset because she had tried to reach out to Sheikh Hasina. She had tried to say, stand for election and then we'll see. But so when I first met her, she was extremely remote. She was quite bitter, actually, about the way her tenure had ended, and how her first tenure in power had sort of the promise of it had faded. She was cracking down on opposition protests. So a lot of what we were covering at the time was the protests being led by the Awami League in Dhaka. You couldn't move in Dhaka. There were hartals practically every other day, and she was very upset about that. But she didn't accept that anything she had done was wrong. The next time I met her was after she had stepped down, and she stepped down within 15 days of taking over in those February elections. And then Bangladesh went for another election in which Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League took part, and eventually Awami League won that one. And just to give you an example of how manufactured the mandate that Khaleda Zia was happy to win in the first election, she won, I think, 278 out of the 300 seats. Yeah. The interesting thing, Stan, is that if you just cut to 30 years later and you cut to the 2013-14 election in Bangladesh and the 2019 and then the 2024, you saw, Sheikh Hasina pretty much doing the same thing, refusing space to the Bangladesh National Party, the BNP, refusing to hand over to a caretaker government, being accused of very much the same kind of sort of rigging of elections that she had once accused Khaleda Zia of. So the 2 times I met her, so the second time I met her, she was actually much more understanding of the kind of anger that was there in the country about her high-handedness. Maybe she had been advised badly. Maybe she had cut herself off from them. And it was clear that in that period from 1996 to 2001, she once again became that leader that everyone had hoped she would be, getting to the streets. But, certain habits sort of remained. And Khaleda Zia was never the street fighter that Sheikh Hasina was. She wasn't as ready for a scrap, if you like, as Sheikh Hasina was. She ruled her party much more from remote, much more through intermediaries, and very much, seemed almost an untouchable figure in that sense. And you look at some of the parallels of her and Sheikh Hasina, so much of the same thing happened, losing loved ones in this very brutal beginning of Bangladesh. The fact that when Khaleda Zia lost elections, we saw her, going into exile briefly. Her sons both went into exile. And over time, she didn't really get to see them very much, except a few visits that she had made abroad. Her own younger son died tragically in 2015. And you see that by then, she and Sheikh Hasina's relationship had really sort of fallen apart. And to the point where even in that hour of grief, she refused to see Sheikh Hasina. And then Sheikh Hasina took this also very personally. So that was the kind of thing, that you saw, that while these were the most powerful women of one of the most populous nations in the world, Khaleda Zia, in a sense, and Sheikh Hasina also had very personal, very bitter kind of relations, which actually meant that they weren't always thinking like statesmen. They were, a lot of the times, were looking at what did the other one do to me when I was out of power, so I will do this to them, in terms of cases that were put against each other. And remember, for the best part of 2.5 decades, they just alternated in and out of power. 91 to 96 with Khaleda Zia, 96 to 2001 with Sheikh Hasina, Khaleda Zia back in 2001 to 2006. And then after that, 2008 onwards, Sheikh Hasina very firmly in power until her ouster last year. So you saw them always with their eye on that political prize, but actually a lot of very petty kind of politics as well played out between them. And then it really began to become much more serious after you saw both sides accuse the other of murderous attacks on the other. Khaleda Zia had herself had a grenade attack on one of her rallies. Sheikh Hasina suffered a very deadly attack on one of her public rallies, a bomb blast, in which many of her associates were killed as well. And when you spoke to either of them, their first reaction was it was the other. And one of the points that I had, and we can discuss this as well, Stanley, is on each occasion when these two women who were a product of Bangladesh's birth, they'd come into politics really with that in their hearts. Each time they fought and their fighting got more bitter, these two centrist figures made space for the fundamentalists. And that's what we saw over time in Bangladesh, whether it was in the first half of that period, if you like, from 91 to 2008, 2010, when, they were in and out of power together. Or even if you looked at the last decade where Sheikh Hasina was firmly in power, was firmly cutting out the BNP wherever possible. She was prosecuting BNP leaders. One of their most famous, prominent young faces, in a sense, was executed. He was hanged in a case involving, connected to the liberation movement, to Sheikh Mujib's assassination. You saw this become extremely personal, extremely bitter, and eventually quite petty.
Yeah. So one is the daughter of the founder of Bangladesh, and the other is the widow of a general who also fought for Bangladesh's liberation. And the battle of the Begums, has been one of the defining factors of Bangladesh's politics, the post-military rule politics. Thanks, Suhasini. Kallol, if we, again, that takes us to the present day Bangladesh. Bangladesh, you have been writing about what's happening in Bangladesh for the last 1 year. And you have just written the profile of Tariq Rahman, because Tariq Rahman is now back in Bangladesh. So the country is also going to hold elections early next year in 2026. So this is a very interesting period from Bangladesh's point of view, because Khaleda Zia is no more. And Sheikh Hasina is not in the country. She is in India, and she has been sentenced to death in absentia. And the Awami League has been banned. So these two prominent political figures are absent from Bangladesh's politics when the country is going to elections next year. And how do you think Khaleda Zia's death at this point of time is going to impact Bangladesh's, the political journey, especially at, the country is now in some kind of a transition. It has to hold elections and have a democratic government, etc., etc. There is a bit of chaos at home, violence, everything is going on, mob violence is going on. So, at this point of time, Khaleda Zia dies, but BNP stands as a formidable political machinery. Tariq Rahman is back in the country. So how do you look at her death or the impact of her death on Bangladesh's politics?
Well, Stanley, Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina themselves are like two streams of continuity for Bangladesh's institutional memory. And one of these streams is now out of the country because she is in exile, and the other just passed away. So, first of all, it's a setback for the people in the political arena of Bangladesh who now have the responsibility of holding on to Bangladesh's political, institutional, and diplomatic memory. Because Khaleda Zia in herself represented the institutional continuity of Bangladesh for almost half a century, going all the time back to her husband's tenure in the late 1970s, because she was a witness to that time. Having said that, a lot of people were anticipating of this particular development within her party. There was a buzz that in case something like this happens, perhaps the party would get a lot of sympathy from the people, and that would work to its advantage. But the way that things are today, it appears that this is also a moment of grave challenge for the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, because if we look back at the last few days, since Tariq Rahman returned from London, first of all, his return itself, in fact, I was also impressed by the kind of crowd that came out on the streets of Bangladesh to welcome Tariq Rahman. But immediately after that triumphant return, we saw that the Jamaat-e-Islami actually scored a major point by snagging the students-led National Citizen Party. So what's happening is that the Jamaat is not intimidated right now. So the Jamaat that partnered Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Khaleda Zia in 2001 to 2006, is not the same Jamaat in 2025. In 2025, this Jamaat is revived, it is revitalized by the infusion of much younger people. Now Jamaat is being led, or not really led, but perhaps being in a way energized by the presence of much younger members who are in their 20s and in their 30s, who don't really share that kind of strong affinity with the memory of 1971. Say people in their 40s and 50s and 60s and obviously 70s and 80s would feel in Bangladesh today, because they either witnessed 1971 or were influenced during their upbringing by the stories of 1971 and the sacrifices that the country underwent. So this is a challenge because Jamaat-e-Islami, which was basically a kind of a quasi partner or a partner in some ways, and then finally very openly in 2001, that Jamaat is now standing against BNP. And the familiar opposition of Sheikh Hasina is not there in front of BNP. And at this time, we don't have Khaleda Zia either to guide or to lead Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and it is now being led by Tariq Rahman. Now, Tariq Rahman was actually in charge of the 2001 Bangladesh Nationalist Party election campaign, in which, of course, BNP won. But in 2001, both the mother and the son were together. So the Khaleda Zia and Tariq Rahman, the elder son, they worked together and they made the party win a majority. And then, of course, they joined hands with the Jamaat-e-Islami. But the fact is that even prior to that, when she became the prime minister in 1991, Tariq was obviously not in a leading position, but he was also part of that team that his mother was leading. So Tariq had that exposure in both the governments. But after those two governments came these 16, 17, or rather perhaps even 18 years old uh, exile for Tariq Zia. And Tariq Zia has been away from Bangladesh. So in this particular period, Khaleda Zia was the on the ground force or leader of BNP, and she conducted a lot of political negotiation with a lot of stakeholders. For example, she met foreign leaders who visited Bangladesh during this time. Like she met Prime Minister Modi when Prime Minister Modi went to Dhaka in June 2015. I'm sorry. But then whether she briefed her son about all those interactions that she conducted in that period in which Tariq was actually away from Bangladesh. Because if you are not on the scene in a volatile political platform, political zone like Bangladesh, then you tend to miss on great many details. And that is a kind of problem that now perhaps Tariq Zia will have to deal with. Number two, of course, is the fact that the Bangladesh Nationalist Party that exists today was actually built by this formerly shy housewife. And the National Standing Committee of BNP was basically a composition and is a composition of people who are chosen by her. All the leaders in the Bangladesh Nationalist Party Standing Committee are her chosen people, be it Alamgir or the Gaheshwar, who is also one of the standing committee members. These are all people chosen by her. So in this kind of a situation, we are really yet to see whether Tariq can bring his team. Because there are stories that Tariq Rahman doesn't get along with some of the senior standing committee members. But can Tariq Rahman bring his team in this particular situation and replace the earlier team? That is something that remains to be seen.
Thank you, Kallol. One last question, Suhasini. With that, we will wrap up the session. One general question about foreign policy. About the relationship between India and Bangladesh. As we all know, India played a historic role in the liberation of Bangladesh, and you also talked about it. And it's interesting if you look at the past roughly 50 years of Bangladesh's history. India had Indo-Bangladeshi relationship has been on a stronger footing when the Awami League was in power. And the BNP, whether it was under Johny Rahman or Khaleda Zia, we have already discussed that Johny Zia had reinforced Bangladesh's Islamic identity, and Khaleda had joined hands with Jamaat-e-Islami, and then sometimes tried to appease the clerical establishment of Bangladesh, etc., etc. And there were tensions between the two countries. But overall, the relationship had remained on a stable trajectory, even though there were ups and downs. But now, if you look at Indo-Bangladeshi relationship, the ties have hit a new low, and there were a lot of issues going on. And on the one side, Bangladesh is in a post-revolutionary phase, and there were a lot of issues between India and Bangladesh. And now Bangladesh is going to have the elections next year, and BNP is, Awami League has been driven underground. Sheikh Hasina is in India, but BNP remains one of the top contenders for power in Bangladesh. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but still, BNP remains a powerful political organization. So, how do you look at the trajectory of Indo-Bangladeshi relationship? This is a fascinating question because you just look at the map. Bangladesh is surrounded by India on all three sides. India is Bangladesh's most important neighbor. But now, if you look at the relationship, no, it's not very good. So how do you look at the trajectory of the Indo-Bangladeshi relationship?
Well, in a nutshell, as you said, India's longest land boundary is not with China. It's not with Pakistan. It is with Bangladesh, more than 4,000, I think about 4,100 kilometers in all. So there is no question that what happens in Bangladesh is of vital importance to India. I think there are 5 Indian states that abut Bangladesh. So any problems inside Bangladesh are going to spill over. Apart from that, there is all the history and all the issues that we have had between us, whether it's been on migration, whether it has been on border trade and smuggling, whether it has been on Bangladesh's ties with Pakistan or Bangladesh's ties with China. These have always been in the mix. But when you add to it what happened over the last year, the August 2024 students' protest that ousted Sheikh Hasina came as a shock for India. That's not something South Bloc likes to say, but the truth is that New Delhi was certainly taken aback despite having such a strong presence inside Bangladesh. It also was taken aback because perhaps it had spent several years not making those strong ties with the other side. So while India was so close to Sheikh Hasina that we'd seen Sheikh Hasina come to India twice just in the months preceding to her ouster, there were very, very fraught ties with the BNP. I remember just 2 years before that, when a BNP lawyer had wanted to come to Delhi to kind of make the BNP's case, to say we are a new party in terms of vision. We're no longer siding with the Islamists. We're no longer seeing Pakistan in the same terms. We are actually seeing India as a much closer neighbor. And Sheikh Hasina had really opened up the potential of what an good India-Bangladesh relationship could mean in terms of trade, in terms of development inside Bangladesh, in terms of investment, in terms of credit lines, and infrastructure construction, as well as, of course, the security of Bangladesh itself. And when this BNP representative had wanted to come to Delhi, Sheikh Hasina's government had been in touch with New Delhi, and they had actually deported this lawyer who had come from London. So in a sense, New Delhi, the second blow, if you like, was not just being too close to Sheikh Hasina, but not being close enough to the BNP. I think the third have been ideas that we've seen over the last year, where India has been extremely concerned about the rising Islamism in Bangladesh, also about the attacks on minorities, but not really sensitive to the kind of concerns we see inside Bangladesh of India's interference, as it is seen, or of attacks on minorities in India itself. And I think that the final point really here is one of the big reasons for the spiraling out of control, if you like, of the relationship has been the really strained relationship between Professor Muhammad Yunus and Prime Minister Modi. The two leaders did actually meet earlier this year on the sidelines of the BIMSTEC summit, but it's been very clear that they don't have a good equation between them, and that New Delhi sees the Yunus regime as an interloper, an interim arrangement without any kind of actual verifiable local support, and the idea that it is only after an inclusive election inside Bangladesh that India will truly recognize the leadership there. And I think that may be also hurting India's cause in a sense in Dhaka, because regimes may stay longer than are expected to stay, although everybody does expect to see an election. So I think the general sense now is that there can be a reset between the two, and that can happen after there are elections there. India has more or less come to terms with the fact that the Awami League will not be allowed to stand for election as it stands today. I think those with some reasonable sense in Dhaka have also come to terms with the fact that Sheikh Hasina will remain in India as long as she wants to. India will not force her to go anywhere else. She took refuge in India under duress. She was not only fleeing those mobs on her doorstep in Dhaka. She was actually expected to fly from India onto a third country. It was believed to be the UK, but the United Kingdom did not give her permission at the last moment, and she stayed on in India. Given the history and given the very serious charges now against her, the death sentence against her, it is highly unlikely that any Indian government would give her up. And I think there is that understanding in Dhaka. What has been perhaps a point of friction, which New Delhi is going to have to deal with, whether the BNP comes to power in February, as is expected, or somebody else comes to power, is that there is deep concern in Dhaka about Sheikh Hasina's political pronouncements that she's making in India. And every time she gives an interview or she does a broadcast with her supporters, it is seen in Dhaka as India allowing someone to use their soil, or India to use its soil to sort of speak against the government or play politics inside Bangladesh. And that is going to continue to be a sore point between the two countries. If New Delhi and Dhaka really want to forge a better relationship, they're going to have to take into consideration all these points of friction before they go forward.
Thank you very much. Interesting times indeed for Bangladesh and also for Indo-Bangladeshi relationship.
And the end of an era, Stan, in a certain sense, this is not just Khaleda Zia, the BNP's leader for 40 years, her passing, which is mourned across the country, but also the end of what we call that battle of Begums between them.
Yeah, both Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina. And Bangladesh is going to see a new beginning next year. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks to Suhasini and Kallol for joining us. Thanks to all our viewers for tuning in.